Now Silva saw, as he had on so many mornings, how the base of Masada rose out of deep wadis on the western side and then projected at a steep slant to about half its altitude. Then abruptly the sides became vertical and continued straight upward to the rim. Now, as he had since he first beheld Masada, Silva secretly saluted the Jew king Herod. What a perfect refuge he had chosen if, as he feared, Cleopatra might have persuaded Antony to gift her with Judea. He would also be safe here from the multitude of enemies he had reason to believe were determined to dethrone him. All dead, long gone, but the monuments to Herod's fears were at last employed. There was now only one route to the summit, a narrow, tortuous niching on the eastern face of Masada, known as the Serpent's Path. And for snakes it might do, Silva swore, since no more than one man could pass at a time. Thus 10 men with a few handy stones could hold off 1,000. From his own camp Silva could see the small palace Herod had built against the face of the northern extremity. There, of course, would be the coolest breezes and almost total absence of the merciless sun, plus what must be a superb view of the Dead Sea and the Judean desert. Silva had thought he might even be able to see the oasis of En-Gedi from such a height, and he had vowed, "There I will take my very best wine and cool my skin once the rock is mine." And Sheva as well. And Sheva as well? Why not? He knew the general scheme of the rest of Masada all too well. Any time he pleased, he need only visit the small camp which he had caused to build, facing the southern tip. It was perched on a high plateau at the very edge of the deepest wadi. So steep were the sides of the chasm that it always made Silva slightly dizzy to look down. But if he ignored the awesome wound in the earth and looked across it to the top of Masada, he could tantalize himself with an eagle's view of the defenders. There, on the level, Herod had built a larger palace and many storehouses. There were lanes leading from one part of the rampart to another, to the reservoirs, and numerous outbuildings with gates and towers to defend it all. Recently Silva had resisted any temptation to visit the southern camp. It was too frustrating to watch your enemy still well fed and well watered after over 2 years, walking about as unconcerned as if they had nothing to fear. Looking down upon them, he had once found himself sighing, "Well done," which he knew to be a dangerous admission when applied to any enemy. Nor would the rock leave his mind after darkness came to the desert. Those ever more frequent nights when his loneliness became unbearable and he took solace in wine, he would sometimes stand outside his tent holding his cup toward the great mass as if it lived and was then only slumbering beneath the stars. Drunk and bemused at its enormous dimensions, he would mumble words at it, reaching out as if he could touch it. "Hail, you sleeping elephant! What would happen if you farted? Roll over, mighty carbuncle on the face of the earth, and dump the Jews in the sea of salt. I will live to crown you, Masada, with a wreath of my urine." Weaving unsteadily in the starlight, his fuddled mind found strange pleasure in remembering that the grandeur and luxury atop Masada, intended for a despot to wait out a revolution, was now occupied by the very sort of revolutionary rabble he had intended to keep out. Silva passed quickly through the small western camp, and then its eastern gate, that formed part of the circumvallation. His head was clearing now. but he was grateful to cross into the shadow of the great rock that stood between the western slopes and the sun. He promised himself that the moment the sun broke over the crest of Masada, he would break off the parley, for he would not, on this wine-soaked morning, or any other morning, stand there squinting up at Eleazar while he enjoyed the sun at his back. It was, of course, no accident that Eleazar never initiated these exchanges during the afternoon when the sun would be in his eyes. The parleys were a problem Silva had thus far been unable to solve, although he had spent long hours discussing ways and means with his staff. In effect, they were minor battles at which he rarely came away the victor, and if they accomplished nothing else for Eleazar, they held up work on the ramp long before after their exchange was done. Everything stopped before an audience of 20,000 odd slaves and soldiers. A Roman general was obliged to duel in words with a Jewish criminal who had spent his lifetime in rebellion. There was, Silva had reluctantly admitted, no choice. Eleazar had taken full advantage of the peculiarities of Masada, and as the great ramp rose towards him, he pressed harder and harder. His words were his artillery. Because of the remarkable acoustics, his words could bridge the distance between the people and his besiegers, and fall where his arrows and stones could not. But his carefully planned speeches he accomplished the encouragement of his own people, and very obviously affected the morale of those thousands of Jews employed on the ramp. Before, during, and long after Eleazar appeared on the heights and shouted his first challenge, the laboring Jews would lie down between the great stones where a whip could not touch them, or scramble to the top of the ramp where the Roman as yet dared venture. The legionary overseers had given up, and now stood with everyone else whips quiet, while they listened spellbound to Eleazar ben Yair, the Sicarius, and Flavius Silva, procurator of Judea. Silva hesitated to estimate how much actual damage these parleys had caused in the morale of his troops. He crossed a dusty wadi, then passed on to terrain which was mostly shale and sand, and red boulders, scattered across iron-hard earth. How much things of little consequence had come to mean. Now it was like viewing the gardens of Rome to discover a few pitiful wisps of vegetation. He came to the base of the great ramp, which was being built of crushed white stone, and rose each day a little farther toward the summit of Masada. The engineers claimed it would be another month before it would extend high enough to erect the assault tower. Another month will take us into April, he mused. That was cutting things very fine. There are always delays and mistakes in any army, if only because rank so rarely matched talent. There was just no time for error here. He found Rubrius Gallus, the tribune responsible for all the engineering work on the ramp. I could find him, Silva thought, among 100,000 people simply by searching for a lateen sail of a nose. There he stood, all the great height of him, his eyes displaying that permanently injured look, as if all the world conspired against him, and he welcomed it, and was determined not to be thwarted regardless of insults to his spirit. There was Gallus hovering over every detail of his enormous project, like some finicky pelican searching despondently for something to please him. Gallus the clever and dedicated road builder, who yearned to build for all time, while the present need was only for speed. Silva remembered the doleful expression on Gallus's face when he had been instructed to build the ramp in a hurry and had been told it made little difference if it fell down the day after Masada was captured. Just let me deliver machines at the top, provide a tower 60 feet high and armed with plate. Inside, give us a ram and we will support it with a brace of catapults to keep Hebrew heads down. Give me that, dear friend, and I'll have us all on our way out of this desert the very next day. Dear friend? Indeed. What better and more trustworthy friend could any general have than Rubrius Gallus, whose wisdom and heart were perfectly matched by his enormous physique? Who else would listen so sympathetically while you told him of the Jewish Sheva? Who else would not once look down the length of such a great proboscis and proclaim the affair as disgraceful or even ridiculous? Gallus, the one true friend, left in all the world to Flavius Silva. Now Gallus was fretting at the delay. He pointed up at the ramparts of Masada and said, "There he stands, sire. I can accomplish nothing until he is gone." Silva looked up at the diminutive figure high above him. He raised his voice only slightly above normal conversation. He spoke in Greek, which most Jews understood, but his own soldiers would not. Hopefully, then, they would not discover what a weak-word warrior he was. But Eleazar, of course, would carefully frame his declarations in Latin to make very sure they would understand. "Hail, Eleazar ben Yair! What would you have of me this morning? Have you at last come to your senses about the matter of surrender?" There was, as Silva had expected, only laughter from the heights. Then he heard Eleazar's voice, like his own, unstrained and yet easily heard. "Last night my usual peaceful slumbers were uneasy because my belly was overfull. I became worried about poor Flavius Silva and his miserable soldiers scratching in the dust of our desert. And a great sense of pity overwhelmed me because I envisioned you down there when the true heat of summer arrives. All night I could think of nothing save how your eyes will fry and how innumerable insects will feast upon your heat sores and open wounds. How goes the dysentery? Do you wonder if you still have intestines? Let me remind you how the coming heat will set your bowels on fire. Have you all carefully examined your skin lately? Do so, I beg you, for it should be coming now with the heat, the curse of our land, which you will all have if you remain in Judea. Leprosy. Even the wind carries it to the valleys of our desert. Look now at your hands and limbs. The smallest lesion is the first sign. If you are alert and go at once to cooler air, then you may be cured. Otherwise, you will wear the bell for the rest of your days. Pomponius Falco and his company had caught up at last. Behind him, Silva heard them exclaiming over the ease with which they could hear the Jew on Masada. They cluck like women spectators discussing a chariot race. He thought with disgust, but he was determined Falco should understand why he consented to such parleys. He calls down a challenge every few days. He asks for me by name, and if I send a subordinate, then he proclaims I am afraid to face his message. He knows very well he must be out by summer or go mad. Hence, he repeatedly reminds us of passing time, which makes the heat worse. He has my troops feeling half sick, whether they are or not. They spend all their spare time pawing themselves looking for diseases they never heard of, and at the slightest sign of a pimple, off they run for the surgeons. By repetition, by constantly striking the heat theme, he intends to make his threats a fact, and it is now very possible he may succeed. Pomponius Falco waved his hand limply at the flies about his face. "How long must you listen to this vermin-infected orator? Would you have me retreat before his words? I do not like fighting battles with my tongue, but until the ramp is finished, I have no other choice." Silva turned his back on Falco and addressed himself once more to the diminutive figure on top of Masada. "Listen to me, Jew, more carefully than you have in the past, when there might have been some petty reason to build false hope in your people. I command you, bring them all to the ramparts now. All of your men, women, children. Let them see how close the ramp approaches, and judge for themselves how long it will be before my legionaries soak their blades in your blood. Then will your people know how you have given them the cruelest of lies, how you have held up false words as shields against the might of your benefactors. They will call you Eleazar the Deceiver for generations, each one telling the next how you were the only cause of their calamity. Surrender now, while there is still time. In the name of Vespasian, I command you to give up your arms and descend. I promise the milk of your mothers will flow again." While Silva held out his right hand to finalize his vow, he glanced over his shoulder at Falco. Listen now, how he will pound away on the same old subject. Silva was almost pleased when Eleazar's voice came down to them, and tonality unchanged, the same easy and relaxed cadence of words, the suggestion of the benign uncle advising a difficult nephew. Perhaps now even Falco would understand that Eleazar ben Yair was no ordinary antagonist. "My people are on the walls now, looking down upon your wretched little soldiers in their fancy dress. O Flavius Silva, poor little general, are you by chance pleading with the true proprietors of this land to spare you at least another 1,000 deaths from the coming heat of summer? Beware of it. There is still time for you to strike your tents and go down to the sea where the air is fresh and cool, where our loathsome diseases will not chew on your bones. Go down to the cool sea to satisfy your lust, where there is wine and all variety of food. Leave us our parched desert and nothing more. Go now, while there is still time. We will send down food and cool water for your journey." While the voice droned on, repeating passages in Latin that were first spoken in Greek, so that all would understand, Falco moved to Silva's side. "This is disgraceful," he hissed. "How can you tolerate such humiliation? As long as he makes you listen, he is insulting Rome. If I refuse to hear him, you may be sure my troops will listen all the more attentively." "My provident arrival makes the solution quite simple. You have merely to inform the ruffian that I have arrived, bearing an order from Vespasian. The emperor has ordained that if they surrender immediately, they will be granted complete amnesty." "Is that true?" For a moment Silva found himself hoping. "Of course not. Once they have given up their arms, you may simply to crucify every one of them, and the matter is done with." Silva looked into Falco's eyes, and for the first time noticed how he had outlined them with some sort of cosmetic. Now he saw that the lips were strangely colored with purple, and he thought, "Since all else is a lie about this man, how can I trust him out of my sight? Yet I most certainly cannot share a tent with him." "Falco, I have underestimated you," he said slowly. "They should send more such clever representatives from Rome, and perhaps my many other problems might be solved. Would you prefer to make the offer yourself? I will consent to do so if you will understand that I am not here to demean you, but to help. Silva thought, I am being forced by circumstance to give up the grape. Otherwise, how can I keep up with this chameleon? He pinched at the ache between his eyes and said, perhaps it will be more impressive if you go up the ramp some distance so that you are separated from the rest of us and appear to function as a new authority. The distance between us and your lack of armor will make your offer more credible. He saw hesitation in Falco's eyes, but before he could find objection, he called out to the ramparts. The gods have been kind to you, Eleazar. 2 great Romans have arrived with the dawn. They are Pomponius Falco, the emperor's deputy, and his aide, Cornelius Tertullus. Vespasian has taken a fatherly interest in your fate. If these men come forward to give you a message, will you guarantee their safety? There was a moment's silence on the mountaintop. Then Eleazar's voice came without change. Let them come as far as they wish. They will not be harmed. But for a moment Silva thought Falco was about to balk, but then he saw his expression settle into such a serious mien, he hardly seemed of the same face. He straightened his blouse and touched at his hair. Yet somehow the gestures were not particularly feminine, and when he beckoned to Cornelius, he seemed to have passed his transformation onto the boy. Both of them started up the ramp as if they were on parade. They halted, erect and proud, some 30 paces up the ramp. Silva found himself entertaining an instant of regret for what he was certain would happen. Then he smiled at his own weakness. Regret for a man you despise? Better spend these precious moments making your own preparations. Keeping his voice just above a whisper, he ordered the archers to fall back and the standard bearers to accompany them. To Attius and Gallus he said, let us count to 20 and then stroll slowly for that large rock over there. As Falco's high voice rang out, Attius and Gallus solemnly nodded their understanding. Jews of Masada, hear the word of Vespasian. Falco paused dramatically. There was no sound in the desert except the harsh plaint of the soaring crows. If you will abandon Masada at once and pledge all of your people to our useful purpose, then all of you will be granted complete amnesty. All of your past crimes will be forgiven. So, what have you to fight and die for now? Ask Eleazar. Ask the men who are your leaders. I await your answer. He does have style, Silva admitted to himself as he moved toward the large rock, and he was fearless in his way. There he stood, quite alone except for the frail boy beside him, chin high, feet spread wide apart, arms folded, as if waiting in judgment on the very mountain itself. Once behind the rock, Silva peered up at the ramparts. Then he said quietly to Attius and Gallus, here comes their answer, as foreseen. They watched a small shape arc over the ramparts, and appeared to hang for an instant against the morning sky. It enlarged, and while descending almost straight down, fragmented into a collection of odd-shaped objects. Then it rained down upon Pomponius Falco and Cornelius Tertullus until they were deluged in garbage. Offal and animal bladders filled with human urine and excrement. Such was the force and volume of the collection, they were knocked off their feet. They picked themselves up, and crying out their dismay, screaming as they discovered each new filth, ran blindly down the ramp. Silva kept his voice perfectly flat when he turned to Attius and Gallus. He shook his head. Pity about this sort of thing, very bad for Roman status.